I love making these civilization videos, but the problem is they're difficult to research in that, say, for a new geopolitics video, I already have a contextual frame that I can shove new information I know into. Thus, I can read a couple books or some articles and spit out a new geopolitics video. Also, in all reality, those are the videos that the audience chooses to watch and keep the lights on. These are my favorite kinds of videos to make, but since they're so hard to research, I've been making a lot of pseudo-civilization videos on topics that are more adjacent to things I've already researched, like American, Russian, Christian, communist, or modern civilization, which are, in each case, extensions of previous civilizations I've already made videos on. Meanwhile, for a new civilization, I have to read a bunch of books explicitly about that society, knowledge which isn't really transferable to any other topic. I've had to read over 6 books just on this one topic since the new year, because to understand a civilization, I want to reach a threshold in which I feel like I can implicitly understand on an intuitive basis what the soul of that society stands for. Whenever I work on these videos, I keep on researching until I've reached the point where I can explain the essence of what that society is about in a single sentence, or give a pretty cogent explanation of what they're about after having knocked back 6 drinks. Here we have another genuine civilization video, with the next ones that'll be coming out are Central Asia and the Jews. I read a couple books on Mesoamerica and still don't pretend to understand it. Here we go with Japan. Japan has fought in a lot of wars, and especially in World War II, massively punched above its weight. And if you want to fight battles like the Japanese did in World War II, and have the thrill of commanding soldiers, tanks, and planes, you can now experience that thrill with War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle war game ever made, with more than 2,000 different planes, tanks, helicopters, and ships that you can use in the most epic combined arms PvP battles, and it's totally free. Every vehicle is completely modeled down to its component parts, with designs from the 1920s until the present. What I find especially cool at this game is that there are no hit points. Instead, the vehicles take damage to their crew and parts, which creates a really immersive experience. They even have a massive bonus pack for new players, and one's returning after 6 months if you use my link in the description. I really enjoy War Thunder and has a lot to offer on several platforms, including Xbox Series X and S, PS5 and PC, and it's free on every platform. Plus, anyone who uses my link below gets a free massive bonus pack, exclusive vehicle designer, 7 days of premium account, a 50% experience and income booster, 2 advanced vehicles for rent, 100,000 silver lions, and more. So try War Thunder today and use the link in the description to get a limited time free bonus pack featuring vehicles and boosters. Part 1. The Nation on the Edge of History. One of the surprising facts about Japan, and why I think a lot of you are watching this video, is that after Anglo-America, Japan is the country in the world with the largest foreign cultural international importance. India has a bigger movie industry and scope, but that largely doesn't export to the rest of the world. Japan has become world famous through anime and video games, alongside in the last century its appliances or cars. This is even more surprising since over its history, Japan is one of the countries most isolated from the rest of the world. One of the points I reached as I studied Japanese history to a greater degree is that it seems like this country exists in a different dimension. Japan isn't really involved with most global trends before the year 1900. Japan is kind of doing its own thing. Over history, you see these waves crash across the global system, making indents and carving out change in different areas. Japan just misses 4/5 of those. Japan is a country with a strange history, and that there are so so few trends of crazy events that come out of it. I once read someone who said Denmark, and the rest of Scandinavia really by extension, was so successful since it's the same group of people who are inhabiting it continuously for the last 4,000 years. You don't have the Mongols or Spanish showing up and burning everything down, forcing your population to restart. Japan is in much the same camp. Over the course of this video, we're going to be comparing Japan to Britain a lot, since they are fascinating contrasts. They share enough to be comparable in that they are both temperate climate islands off the coast of larger continents, which are both removed and attached to the trajectories of the neighboring continents. Both became wealthy countries with histories of kickstarting industrial revolutions on their neighboring continents and imperialism. Past this point, you start to see fascinating differences and similarities between them, one of which being that Britain's history from the 1,000 years around the birth of Christ until 1066 was one of constant invasions.
Britain was invaded by the Romans, Irish, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Danes, Norwegians, or Normans.
For the modern English, half their genetics, as well as most of their culture, language, legal code, or anything else, comes from these invaders. For Japan, literally none of this happened. This also leads to the point that the Japanese are a much more insulated and isolationist country than Britain. Although both countries have had phases of imperialism and reaching outwards, for the British they became the largest colonial empire in history. Meanwhile, the Japanese spent the early modern period, or from 1600 to 1860, completely divorced from the rest of the world. An interesting side effect of this is that the Japanese have lots of older traits that you wouldn't see otherwise in the rest of Eurasia. Ironically, there's a lot of similarities here to India, which was partially split off from the main competitive area of Eurasia by mountains. One being that Japan and India both have elements of polytheism where they venerate many gods. Another that Japanese religion, or Indian, have traces of animism and shamanism left. The modern Japanese showed up around 300 BC, much like the Celts in Britain, and took over the island from the local Ainu or Jomon people. Ironically, it was pretty hard to get information about this, where a lot of the sources purposely try to obfuscate the information, trying to make it look like the modern Japanese are the direct descendants of the Ice Age first hunter-gatherers. Then, after the Yamato Japanese settled this territory, no one has replaced them since. After that, the Japanese have faced really no disturbances for the next 2,500 years, with being punctuated by a failed Mongol invasion which didn't make it past the beaches in the 13th century, or the Americans nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki, occupying Japan for the next 7 years and then giving it independence. This is why the Japanese ruling family has had the longest contiguous rule of any dynasty in world history, supposedly going back to 500 BC, but really probably to around 700 AD. Japan, frankly, is one of the simplest histories of any country I've studied. The main historical trend I can tease out in Japanese history is that of centralization and decentralization of the government. The centralized governments tended to try to make Japan more in line with foreign societies, while the decentralized ones tend to be more Japanese localist. This is a trend you often see in societies where strong, centralized imperial elites can simp off far larger foreign empires, while local warlords are more nationalistic. Another aspect of this is that the first type of regime is more likely to lead Confucian, while the latter Buddhist, which is ironically the opposite of Chinese trends. Ironically, Japan has a pretty similar political history to Germany, except for one major detail. You have the establishment of a kingdom in the 600s among tribes, based off the precedent of a neighboring, larger, much older empire, that being Rome or China. This empire can't form a strong enough bureaucracy, so falls into feudalism around 1000 AD. The centralized government really falls apart in the 1200s. Power becomes divided between spiritual and secular authorities, that being the emperor and shogun in Japan, or the emperor and pope in the Holy Roman Empire. The one major detail which separates German and Japanese political history is in the Japanese equivalent to the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, they were able to reunify the country, while in Germany it took another 200 years. years. For alternate history, it would be as if Wallenstein under the Habsburgs reunified Germany into a centralized conservative Catholic monarchy. Then the Inquisition would purge Germany of revolutionary and Protestant elements. After this, Japan and Germany industrialized in the late 19th centuries, going through a pseudo-liberal era and then a phase of profound nationalism. After feeling humiliated, they insanely declared war on the rest of the world in World War II before getting crushed by the US, becoming a de facto colony, and then experiencing stunning economic growth in the post-war period before facing the worst aging of any society in the world today. The reasoning for this is complex, but as I explain in this video, you can predict political structure based off family structure. Japan and Germany have the same family structure, or that in which the oldest son inherits everything. From that, they face similar incentive structures and thus make similar calculations with similar endpoints. Beyond this very cursory glance, let's look further into the Japanese character. Hey, for a brief aside, you guys should check out my second podcast on a different YouTube channel called History 102, where I explain different historic topics such as the fall of Rome, Japan's position in World War II, the American Civil War, and we're trying to cover all of history. We take an hour to explain different historic topics. And I do this with Eric Torenberg, so if you want to learn history in a fun and conversational way, check out History 102. Part 2, The Land and People. Japan is around the size of the state of Montana and has 120 million people. For a frame of reference against Britain, which in sheer size is significantly smaller than Japan, with Britain being the size of Alabama or Michigan. That being said, in the same way Egypt itself is a big country geographically, but all the inhabitable land in Egypt is the size of Belgium, almost all of Japan's land is uninhabitable, with only 11% of the territory being arable. Ironically, a lot of that territory has turn been taken up by the Tokyo metro area. What that means is that Japan's 120 million people are clustered in a very small geographic area, which is why Tokyo is the most populous city in the world. For a frame of reference, Britain has half the population of Japan on a much larger amount of actually useful land. I was reading a book on rice agriculture to research this video, and it would say stuff like you could support a family off 1 acre of rice farming, and that blew my mind because coming where I'm from in Pennsylvania, I always heard that 20 acres was the minimum size for a family to support a farm, and that's generally been the size that's been stable for Western history going back to the Middle Ages. An interesting thing is that Japan is one of the countries in the world which has the least geographic mobility over its history in the pre-industrial world. What that means is that people would stay in the same villages for thousands of years. Then once industrialization kicked in, there was mass social mobility with people moving all over the country to major cities. This fact, or that people were stuck together for so long, explains an important fact about the Japanese character, that being fear of rejection. As Aristotle said, the greatest strength of a society when pushed to an extreme will become its greatest weakness. For example, in America, the can-do spirit results in the immense capability America has demonstrated over its history, but also our nation's worst flaw, or its inability to make trade-off decisions and mass delusion. Meanwhile, for Japan, its greatest strength is the sheer social cohesion of the Japanese. How the Japanese can force a group of people to have fanatical courage, insane precision, profound obsession, but also that the worst aspect of the Japanese character is the abdication of responsibility to the group. Both of them stem from the nature of Japan's geography and agriculture. Japan is a purely rice farming nation, of which there actually aren't that many which are important. India and China are split between some areas that are rice farming and others that are wheat farming, while in both countries the wheat farmers are dominant. Rice farming requires mass cooperation of labor, and across studies, we've found the most collectivist societies in the world are rice farmers, which you can even see inside India or China. Thus, the Japanese have a strong collectivist, groupish spirit. The Japanese are one of the most collectivist people in the whole world. That being said, the Japanese are better at collectivism than the Chinese or Indians. India and China both allow a significant amount of free riding in their social structures, while Japan is fanatically against free riding. Japan is the wealthiest and most advanced collectivist society, and if Japan wasn't there, we could make the argument that you needed to be individualist to industrialize and succeed, but Japan follows followed by China and Korea, have proven this principle wrong, that you can have advanced collectivist non-Western societies. Japan is the most neotenous population in the world. Neoteny is a trait which is childlikeness or youthfulness. Neotenous populations are intelligent, civilized, adaptive, neurotic, trend-based, and groupish. Inside the West, the west coast of America or the Netherlands are both very neotenous populations. This plays into the Japanese character really heavily, as you're going to see over this video, with both the positive and negative aspects of neoteny playing out. Collectivism in China is enforced by the state, while in India by the religion. Authoritarian power is generally less effective at enforcing social norms rather than bottom up through culture. In Japan, social custom enforces collectivism. What this does mean is that Japan suffers greatly from what Francis Fukuyama, a ethnically Japanese author, calls the tyranny of cousins, or cultural tyranny. Japanese society has no chill and is ruthless towards those who don't measure up to group expectations. Scandinavians have a similar culture. You'll hear about Japanese companies having incredibly aggressive social expectations, such as working unpaid overtime every day, drinking for many hours after work, and very strict minor social stuff like dress or etiquette, and more so, that's taboo to break. Again, it reminds me of Germany, where pretty unimportant rules are followed obsessively and autistically. One of the best books on Japan, and frankly one of the best anthropology books I've ever read, is The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. It was written during World War II as part of an anthropology project by the US military to assess how to militarily occupy and democratize Japanese culture. The top thesis of the book was that the greatest strength of Japanese culture was also its greatest weakness, or the obsessive intensity of the culture. This was most obvious in the World War II era, with the kamikaze pilots who would fly planes committing suicide to try to take down American ships, or the suicidal bonsai charges in order to avoid the humiliation of becoming prisoners of war. I read a lot of books on Japanese culture for this video, and many of these were written on how to interact socially with the Japanese. I'm guessing for American companies who do business in Japan. There are two interesting things about the Japanese social code. The first being that a great flaw of Japanese culture is how petrified it is of rejection. It's interesting to see how deeply the Japanese build their culture around avoiding rejection. It makes sense when you think about how for most Japanese over history, they were stuck in the same village for their entire lives, and were completely reliant on their fellow villagers for rice farming. For example, when tested, when American high schoolers compete against each other, they finish their tasks faster. Meanwhile, Japanese high schoolers are much slower since they're petrified of alienating their relationships with other students. I'll read stories, for example, of a Japanese folk tale about a royal court where one of the courtiers gives correct advice to the king, and the other courtiers give advice that turns out to be incorrect. The courtiers who gave the incorrect advice then try to murder the courtier who gave correct advice to clean their honor. Another is that in Japanese culture, it's totally socially taboo for an inferior to give a superior the slightest level of criticism. Stuff that would just be laughed off in America as silly, in Japan is treated as the worst social taboo. This is interesting to me since I'm from a different honor culture, since I'm of Irish and Scottish ancestry. Growing up, my parents both told me that honor was the most important thing in life, and if someone insulted my honor, it was my duty to fight back. Likewise, the Celts also share Japanese levels of fanaticism, especially in war. That being said, besides this, the Celtic and Japanese concepts of honor are the exact opposite. In Japanese culture, the dishonor comes from attacking your integration inside the group. In most cultures in the world, but especially East Asia, you have a concept of face, or how you relate to your abstract concept of your social duty for someone of your social class or role. In Japan, you have to protect your sense that you are doing your face. In Celtic culture, it's the exact opposite, in which someone insults your honor when they insult your individuality. When someone tries to infringe on your freedom, screws you over, or gives you an order. Interestingly, in most social studies, the two extremities are the Japanese on one end and the Americans on another. This is an individualism, collectivism axis, which is really real. On the other hand, you do see a lot of similarities between the Japanese and Americans. They are both high trust, socially cohesive, wealthy, functional societies. Although most social social science surveys only really sample people from East Asia and the West on any scale. Although there are millions of metrics on how society works, another very important one is high trust versus low trust. An individualist low trust society would be a lot of Native American peoples, and collectivist low trust would be Africa or India. Another thing I found interesting about Japanese social structure is that in Japan it's expected that a stepmother is supposed to hate and mistreat her stepdaughter. The stepdaughter is in turn supposed to accept this, but then she's allowed to be mean to her new stepdaughter as revenge. I found this to be a fascinating microcosm, since this is the exact kind of thing Christianity or the Abrahamic religions were invented to avoid. Can't we just not be mean to each other in the first place? Meanwhile, what this shows is the Japanese venerate tradition in the group above logic, common sense, or simplicity, something which I'll explain at length later. In Japanese culture, you're not allowed to speak up against the group. One of the interesting books I read while researching this video was Oriental Ways of Thinking by Nakamura. It's a book written by a Japanese guy in the 60s where he analyzed the lingual structure of Asian languages to determine their underlying logical structures. An interesting point he made is that the Japanese prioritize the local social group. This is partly why the Japanese corporation demands exceptional loyalty and dedication from its workers. It also manifests in the Japanese seeing other ethnicities as subhuman, or why the Japanese were so brutal in World War II. The negative side of the Japanese character is the abdication of responsibility to the group. In the Japanese character, there's this idea that if we follow our social duties, that everything will work out. Again, this is something where the Celts, the most individualistic population in the world, are the exact opposite. That being said, that comes with the opposite issue of the Celts being stuck in permanent intractable civil wars and disunity. That being said, over the course of Japanese history, you have repeatedly seen this result in basically hurricanes of issues that compound into insanity due to people doing their strict social duties with no one looking out for what that means on the collective level. This doesn't exist in China, since China was socialized around a hierarchical bureaucratic government, while Japan's is based off socialization due to village life. Examples of this include World War II, where the top Japanese commanders knew that war with America was suicide, but the Japanese were all trying to outdo the other in patriotism. You weren't allowed to express non-patriotic ideas. Thus, everyone kept virtue signaling until the Japanese ended up fighting an impossible war against the rest of the world. Another being how Japan experienced the greatest financial crash in history in the 1990s, since everyone was printing money to an insane level. Financial bubbles are the end point of toxic groupthink. My father would say that if something is about achieving the highest numerical amount, the Japanese would win. The top collector of any item or the best person at some absurd hobby will always be Japanese. Dan Carlin once said the Japanese suffer from having too much of good things. We generally like things such as discipline, patriotism, dedication, and more, but the Japanese push all these things to the level of absurdity since there's no feedback loop in the culture to know. Germany is similar in this regard. In Japanese culture, undue pride is seen as the worst sin. This creates a very cohesive society, but it also makes speaking out against the group impossible. Japan has produced no great thinkers, no technological innovation, or incredible breakthroughs, since it's a culture which does not allow bucking the consensus. The positive side of this is that the Japanese have been capable of making incredibly rapid changes. For just their modern history, this includes their openness to the West in the early 17th century, their complete isolation from the world, which was taken to absurd levels from the 17th to mid-19th centuries. After that, their openness to the West again, extreme nationalism, and then pacifism. Complete loyalty to the group means Japan can carry out drastic changes very quickly with complete determination. The Japanese don't have a distrust of government, which you see by them having a big government. I keep on recommending books in this video since most of the books I had to read to research this video were not good, so I want to recommend the good ones so you know what to read if you want to study this topic yourselves. That being said, Taggart and Murphy's book was great, and the thesis of that book is largely that Japan is a socialist economy. Japan since World War II was the place in the world outside the communist bloc where the managerial class had the most power over society. It had government control of prices, giant government-sponsored monopolies running everything, the government abused money printing massively, while the government controlled wages too. Japan is capitalist on the outside and is really a state-sponsored economy. The Japanese economy did well partly when they had a lot of young people, but also when the memory of World War II was traumatic dramatic enough that the elite wasn't morally corrupt. That gradually degraded over this period. This is a trend you can see going back centuries. The Japan of the 17th century was the most oppressive country in the world. It had a giant secret police, absurd regulations, an entrenched caste system. It was literally a society where a samurai was legally allowed to decapitate any peasant who he felt disrespecting him immediately without due process. The Japanese are obsessed with stability and will happily hand over freedom in exchange for safety. One of the things Westerners don't understand is that Asian cultures literally need hierarchy to function socially, as in Asian social codes are dependent upon hierarchical positions. Their language literally is different grammatical forms for how the person you are speaking to relates to you in a social hierarchy. I find East Asians always try to look for a social hierarchy with set rules and then rise in said hierarchy, rather than trying to form their own system and break away. Part 3. The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. I spoke before about in this video the book The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which I think is the best book on Japan. It highlights an important duality to Japanese civilization, in that it's a society that can be unimaginably brutal, as we saw in World War II, but is also capable of stunning sensitivity and beauty. All civilizations need a duality of two opposing values to stay sane. For the Japanese, I would simplify it to Bushido and Zen. For those who don't know, Bushido is the Japanese code of chivalry. It was used by the samurai in the pre-modern era. An interesting historical thing is that it's symbolic for the totality of Japanese civilization, in that when Japan militarily unified, it had no real use for the samurai warrior nobility. At the same time, Japan was experiencing an economic revolution in which the merchant classes were growing wealthier than the nobility. The centralized government then made the samurai into government bureaucrats. Japan moved from a society run by a warrior noble class to a bureaucratic managerial one in the 17th and 18th centuries. Today, it is possibly the country in the world where the managerial class has the most power. That being said, the government at this point made the samurai keep their values of Bushido and use them for the government bureaucracy. Imagine the DMV or IRS workers obsessively doing their desk job with fanatical loyalty that a warlord would demand of his knights. That being said, when Japan modernized in the late 19th century, this class instilled the populace with Bushido. In the pre-modern era, Japanese peasants didn't have a concept of honor, but with the school system, it meant Japanese of all classes fought with incredible courage and determination. A similar trajectory is Shinto. Shinto was a collection of folk beliefs in Japan that existed before Buddhism. With the rise of nationalism, Buddhism was seen as foreign, and so the government distilled these folk beliefs into a religion. In reality, that form of Shinto was as much of a real religion as the worship of the Norse gods in Nazi Germany or communism was. Interestingly, China and Japan have a similar crystallization of unification of Buddhism, Confucianism, and the standardization of local folk beliefs, that being Shinto in Japan and Taoism in China. We've gone through the aspect of Japanese culture I'm meaning to represent here with Bushido, or the rigid social values. That being said, this creates a balance in the Japanese soul, allowing intense subjectivity or love of beauty. It's interesting that Japanese culture can either be the most feminine or masculine, depending on how you want to measure it. Geert Hofstader's cultural metrics say Japan is the most masculine culture in the world, given it prioritizes strong gender differences, materialistic achievement, dominance duty, and fought very bravely in the world wars. Hofstadter was writing in the 20th century before anime showed the new face of Japan. That being said, the other side is that you can make out Japan to be the most feminine society in the world through its obsession over social subtleties, irrationalities, subjectivity, or relational dependence. The Japanese are irrational in a way that we don't have in the West. For a great example of this, let's look at Zen. The time period when a society is developing has a big impact upon its entire history, much like an individual and their childhood. That being said, Buddhism had a bigger influence on Japan than China, since Buddhism was dominant in East Asia while Japan was forming, while China had already been around for millennia. Buddhism, and especially the types of Buddhism popular at that time, has needled itself deep into the Japanese psyche. Buddhism prizes detachment from the world and the monkey brain of logical causal thought. Zen Buddhism, which was very popular in the medieval period as Japan was developing, the main thesis of which is that you have to break out of the cage that is logical thought. Meanwhile, Pure Land Buddhism, similarly to Protestantism, believes that faith in the Buddha data can guide us to enlightenment. If you look at Japanese art, you can see this. In Japanese or Zen art, there is the concept of wabi-sabi, or rustic imperfection making something perfect. This is why Japanese art, food, and culture tends towards a minimalist style. I believe Japan is the only artistically creative society left in the world, since their worldview allows comfort and structure inside irrationality. In a postmodern world in which you're not allowed to have meta-narratives, the West has collapsed into degeneracy and stupidity. Meanwhile, Japan is a pre-established social structure which is designed to operate in the absence of logic, thus they keep on making amazing art. Also, why postmodernism hasn't totally destroyed their social structure in the manner it has in the West. Lots of societies, including the West now with wokeness, get stuck in ideological cages. This has never happened to the Japanese. This sense of irrationality allows the Japanese to sidestep overthinking to just do stuff. It gives the Japanese a sensory mechanical sense that's the most advanced in the world. The Japanese can't invent things, but they're the best in the world at improving them. This is why the Japanese are so intensely good at stuff like mechanics, art, war, or other material things. In World War II, the Japanese sidestepped Western military doctrine, and in the post-war period, the Japanese industrial field sidestepped management theory. Part 4. Why did Japan win? Japan is the great exception to globalization. In a world where the Europeans modernized and dominated the world for centuries, the Japanese are the exception. The Japanese are the great non-Western power which was able to beat the Europeans at their own game. Japan was able to industrialize, modernize, and in turn have its own colonies, while every other non-European country wasn't able to. Why? The other thing is that I would have been completely incapable of predicting this in advance. If I lived in the 19th century and you told me that one non-European country would be able to modernize, I would have guessed the Turks. The Turks had been fighting the West for centuries and been able to keep abreast of them for a pretty long time, while also just being geographically and ethnically closer to Europe. It could be chance, and I think historians don't give chance enough credit for determining the fate of history, but the Japanese also nearly westernized in the early 1600s, so I don't think so. In the 17th century, Japan was the only non-European country to take Western-style guns, tactics, and to study the West deeply. Christianity was popular in Japan, which it wasn't anywhere else in Asia. Japan had a harsh conservative turn, but it was pretty open to the West over the course of the 16th and early 17th centuries. Japan also has a history of very rapid changes towards some foreign standard, one being in the 8th century with the importation of Chinese civilization. Later on, the changes to the West in modern history. In both cases, Japan never had the China or India issue of becoming so big that it became arrogant. Japan was always in China's neighborhood, so they had to stay relatively humble. I think the reason is that Japan has a few similarities to European societies which the rest of Asia doesn't. These might not be apparent at first, where the Japanese are culturally very different in most ways, but they have changed Japan's entire history, those being the Japanese family structure and feudalism. Ironically, although we crap on it today, feudalism as a social structure has pretty good effects on society. Feudalism is a system with a weak central king who disperses authority to a nobility, who have peasants in exchange for militarily protecting them. Europe and Japan were both feudal during the Middle Ages. Feudalism establishes a couple things. Firstly, it develops a sense that social relationships are based on reciprocal benefit. Next, it creates a division of power, which in turn creates checks and balances to prevent tyranny. I've said before that the most important thing that made the West successful was a social structure with competing social classes, thus preventing a monopoly on power. Ironically, in both Europe and Japan, feudalism resulted in a growing merchant class who displaced the nobility, who you would expect to dominate a feudal society. For this reason, Japan had one of the best developed property rights of any Asian country. Also, interestingly, Japan was the only country in the eastern half of Asia to have a concept of honor, something it shared with Western Europe until recently. All of this created a diverse, pluralistic social structure which had a lot of similarities with Western Europe. People often wonder why social development fails in one society and succeeds in another. The real answer is how pluralistic a society is, or how many many elements are independent from the state in its culture. The second reason is that Japan has the loosest clan structure of any society in Asia. I've spoken about before you can use family to predict political or social structure across the world. Across the rest of Asia, strong clans took over society. Emmanuel Todd has a lot of cool work on this topic, and he said that as the clan grew stronger over the last 1,000 years in Asia, the societies fossilized. He blames the nomadic invasions and wars for this process. I'm not sure how much we really know about this topic, and I get the sense Emmanuel was filling in gaps of knowledge I have no idea how we could possibly have information on. That being said, Japan has the closest thing to the West's nuclear family that you'll find in Asia. There are clans in Japan, but much like the Celts, they play a much smaller role in determining someone's life than the rest of Asia. Clans push towards conservatism. In strong clan societies, people are in arranged marriages made by their parents. They work the kind of work their clan tells them to. They live with their clan. Imagine if your entire life was dictated by your parents. It creates a pressure towards conservatism. In Japan, there are still arranged marriages, and the oldest son lives with his parents, but the rest doesn't happen. This opens up Japanese society to innovation and creativity not seen in the rest of Asia. It's remarkable to see how little details like this can change the fate of a country, as we've clearly seen in Japan being vastly wealthier and more successful than any other countries in Asia. Japan is a nation of great contrasts. It's a country which has precipitous aging now. Japan has been in a recession ever since 1990, which is coincidentally the year they ran out of young people. Japan has some of the worst aging in the world, so much so that it will kill their country. There will be 6 Japanese for every 100 now at the end of this century if trajectories continue. This all means that the current Japanese creativity is doomed. Japan will not be the cultural powerhouse that it currently is in 20 years. The good news is that there are no neighboring countries that are capable of colonizing Japan in any real sense. This will require them to change their current direction. It wouldn't surprise me if the Japanese go off in a very conservative, family values-oriented direction as a way to increase their birth rate. The story never stops, and our current era will be remembered as a short blip in the continuous history of Japan. The Japanese have a lot to be proud of, as one of the most impressive nations in the world. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Click the link in the description in order to get a free bonus pack and start fighting epic battles today.